Well, good morning once again, and welcome to February. I don't know how we got here so fast, but welcome to February. And we are just glad that you're joining us on this winter morning as the chill settles back in, as the frost comes back around. We're beginning a new series today, and for me, it's really an exciting series to start. So we're continuing in this year-long journey through personal discipleship and what it means to live Christ-like lives, and how all of that matters when it comes to passing the torch to a new generation, right? So this series is designed to challenge those thoughts and those beliefs that as we live into and as we grow into an ever-changing society and an ever-changing culture, to live, as it were, against the grain. Now, if you've done any kind of woodworking in your lifetime, this may ring some bells for you. It may trigger some kind of memory. When you're doing any kind of woodworking, you are taught from the beginning to always go with the grain, right? Always go with the grain of the wood. Whether you're sanding it, staining it, or even cutting it, you want to go with the grain of the wood. It gives you a smoother look, and it makes things a little bit easier as you try to work with it. When you go the other way, it tends to chip the wood, it tends to cut the wood harder. But when you go against the grain, it makes the job a little bit tougher in texture. To go against the grain, to cut against the grain, means you have more chance to kind of bind the blade. And if you don't know what that means, I'll let you know in about a minute. When you work against this kind of intense pressure, and if you're not careful, that saw and that wood can kick back on you and cause some damage. Okay? I can remember about 20 years ago, I was working at a shop in Philly. I was building a set at the Walnut Street Theater. And the more comfortable you get with power tools, the faster you think you can do things, and the more times you think you can cut some corners to make it go faster. And we were moving along. We were on this timeline, and I was cutting this piece of plywood down. I was working on a table saw, ripping it down like you're supposed to, and what it needed to be. But then I needed to cut across the grain. And instead of grabbing the saw that I should have grabbed to use the appropriate tool for the job, I said, oh, you know what? I'll just cross-cut it on the table saw. I'm here. I'm doing it quick, right? And at first, everything's going smooth. You're pushing through, no problem. But about halfway through, it turns and it binds. And the wood starts to get rougher and harder. And the next thing I knew, that piece of wood's about 10 feet behind me, impaled in the wall. And I nearly missed my coworker. So these are stories to have if you're ever walking through something. It's not easy to go against the grain of the wood. Life in modern society is not much different for us today. To go against the grain of culture can produce friction. It can rub people the wrong way. It can put us in situations we never thought we would be put into, to make decisions about that we never thought we would have to. But if we're going to dive into what it means to follow the way of Christ, then we need to understand what it means to live a life against the grain. Now, you may be here this morning a longtime veteran of following Jesus Christ. And you may feel that these struggles are behind you some. Or maybe this is just all new and you have no idea what I'm talking about right now, and that's okay. We're going to dive into this together. I mean, you're kind people, right? You love people. You work hard. You're not mean people. Right? That's the barometer right now for what constitutes a good person. But if we're not careful, we can miss just how much culture has gradually sucked us in, right? We said it a few weeks ago. We love drama. We love reality television. How many of us have been part of the water cooler talk? Or the parking lot conversation, right? How many of us have brought a person down a peg and did it with a smile on our face because we love them, right? Or worked that extra hour because you needed to do this thing for your boss, but you missed dinner at home, or you missed your kid's soccer game? How many of us have missed fellowship or worship because of some sort of sporting event, or canceled everything just so you can catch the game that week? Culture itself is alluring. It wants us to follow the grain because it's easier, it's smoother. People will respect us, or we're going to be liked. But what if you said no? Not today. It probably wouldn't be easy for you. We'd face ridicule or reprimand. I know I've been there in my lifetime. But what if you chose to defy the cultural norms today and went against the grain. I want to look at a story this morning of three men who did just that. We're going to go back to the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, and we're going to look into the lives of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, those names may not be familiar to you right now, but that's because their names were changed when Israel was taken captive by the Babylonians. The king would pick out these boys of royal descent, and then he would rename them and bring them up in the way of Babylon. They would sort of be reprogrammed to start following the culture of the day. Now, these three, they were renamed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? Those seem to ring some bells. And plus, you have Daniel in that mix, and they were put into positions of power through a number of events that happened in Daniel 1 and 2. They had others who served under them now, and they had a good rapport with the king. And that brings us to our story this morning, and this comes out of Daniel 3. In that time, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, and set it up on the plains of Dura in a province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officers to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, magistrates, and all the other provincial officers assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "Nations and people of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the nations and people of every language fell down and worshiped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So King Nebuchadnezzar, right, he builds this golden image, and if you follow what a cubit is, right, a cubit is the tip of your finger to your elbow, right? This is basic measurements of cubits. It's 90 feet tall, 9 feet across, right? It is a big image of gold. And he calls all the ranking officials from multiple nations that Babylon had conquered to come to him so that they might bow down in front of this giant statue that he created. Now, we don't know if this was an image of himself or some other god. We have no idea. But clearly, this image is very a strong personal connection, and he has a strong personal feeling about this statue, that his herald proclaimed that anyone who does not bow down to the statue, when they hear this music, they will basically be burned alive, right? He feels really strongly about this image. I don't know why. So he has all the officials there from Persia and Israel and Assyria, all the places that Babylon had conquered, and he's like, okay, it's time to bow down or die. You choose. So when they hear the music, they fell down and bowed before the statue. I mean, that is real pressure. That's the choice you have to make, bow or die. Have you felt that kind of pressure before? It's okay. It's just this one time. No one's going to really know that you took that. So what if you miss 1 week? I mean, no one's really counting anyway, right? No one counts. I know we're supposed to read every day, but does today really matter? And is anybody going to ask me? When we get in those moments, are we willing to have a bold faith in the face of pressure? Are we willing to have a bold faith in the face of pressure? And that's where we found these three guys this morning, right? Faced with a decision to make, faced with overwhelming pressure, what do they do? Well, like most of humanity and even culture, there's someone who's going to point out if someone's doing a different thing, right? Someone's going to tattle on him. It's going to happen. And so for these three guys, the astrologers, who they come running up to the king, and they told on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They ran to the king and said, "You've commanded that every time you hear all kinds of music that we need to bow down to this giant statue that you made. Oh, and don't forget that if we didn't bow down, you were going to throw us into a burning fire." But there are some Jews who you set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold that you've set up. There's these three guys who aren't doing what you said that they would do. And don't forget, you said you would throw them into a fire, right? Maybe they were jealous. Maybe they were envious that these three Hebrews have now been put in charge of them. You see, catch that? They reminded the king of the position that these three had and that they disregarded the king. And so like any king, he reacts to that, right? Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summons Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these three men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold that I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the harp, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image that I have made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Nebuchadnezzar tries to reason with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? I mean, look, guys, come on, look. If you just bow down, it's all good. It's all good. Go back to work. Everything will be fine if you just bow down. But if you're not going to do that, then I'm going to toss you into this fire. It sounds crazy to us. But how many of us know a Nebuchadnezzar? I picture it like the movie Office Space, right? Boss saddles up, coffee in hand. "Yeah, I'm going to need you to come in on Saturday." And you say, no, I've got this thing for my kid. I can't come in on Saturday. He said, well, here comes the reply, right? Well, if you don't come in on Saturday, then you might as well not come in on Monday. Have you been there? Who or what is the Nebuchadnezzar that we face today, right? It's not always a person. It could be a thing, even a good thing. But when the good thing becomes the consuming thought that you have and the consuming thought over your actions, it becomes the idol that we bow down to. Tim Keller once said that the idolatry can be allowing a good thing to become the ultimate thing in our hearts. Kevin DeYoung calls them the isms of our lives, right? Life is all about the experiences I have, so I'm consumed by that next adventure. I have to advocate for the little guy, so my life becomes consumed over advocacy over something. I have to make it to Sunday's game, because if my team doesn't win, I'm going to be miserable for the next week. Even good things can become the ultimate thing. It's those pressure points in life. And like the three this morning, when those pressure points hit, do we have the courage to go against the flow? Do we have the courage to go against the grain? Would we have the courage to stand up and say, "Not today"? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he doesn't, we want you to know this, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship your image of gold that you've set up." Check out this response. These three exiles are talking to the king of an empire, standing for what they believe by not saying anything at all. We don't feel the need. They don't feel the need to defend themselves. They didn't condemn the Babylonians or anyone else for doing what they were doing. They knew when to speak, and they knew when not to speak. They didn't need to defend why they have done what they've done. But they only wanted to live for what God had called them to do. How often have we been there in the face of trouble, right? We jump to our own defense, right? To argue back and tell people why they are wrong. We want to jump to ourselves, right? I know I have been there more times than I want to count on one hand, right? How many times have we been faced with the realization that the cultural norms and practices around us supersede our belief systems? We work just so we can get to vacation, forgetting what it means to actually take a day of rest. We know more about American history than we do about Scripture. We can quote movies, but we can't quote the Bible. We know which star is where and how Taylor's going to get to Kansas City next week. But we don't know where God is moving in our lives. We get enraged over the kneeling of the national anthem, but we've gone silent over faith and education. Politics have divided believers to the point of ruining relationships. Churches are dying everywhere because we value tradition and flash and this and that over the truth to defy cultural norms. Culture is constantly trying to pull us in line with the grain, with the flow. If you do it just one time, then very good. But if you don't do this, it's going to be rough for you. I'm going to make it rough for you. Do we have the strength to stand in the face of that and say, I don't need to defend myself. I live to honor God in all that I do. I believe He will save me from whatever will come. And now catch this last part. If you missed it all, catch this. But if He doesn't, even if He doesn't, I'm not going to bow down to culture. Even if He doesn't save me. It's that moment courageous faith really comes out of us. If they knew God would always save them, they wouldn't need to trust Him. They wouldn't need faith if they knew it was always going to happen. It was just a safety net. But it's in the unknown outcome where you can say, either way, I'm going to serve God. Either way, I'm going to follow the right path. That's when we learn to trust God in the fire. See, then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace be heated up 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of his strongest men in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent that the furnace was so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw in the fire? They replied, certainly, Your Majesty. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed. And the fourth looks like the son of the gods. There's a story about Charles Blondin. He was an entertainer back in the 1800s. He was a tightrope walker. He was the first guy to tightrope across the Niagara Falls. Okay? And he would do it several times. And like any entertainer in the business, right, you have to continue to do something more with a wow factor if you're going to keep your audience, or you're going to lose them. They're going to walk away from you. So he'd walk across Niagara Falls on stilts. He'd stand on a chair that was perched on one leg on the tightrope across Niagara. He even sat down one time in the middle and cooked himself an omelet, okay, over the falls. But this one time, he wheels a wheelbarrow across the tightrope. It's full of concrete. And he gets to the other side, and the crowd, they go wild, and he dumps out the concrete, and he shouts, do you believe I could do it again? And so the crowd starts screaming, yes, of course you can. You're the great Blondin. He shouts back, do you believe I could do it with someone in the wheelbarrow? Yes, of course, you're the great Blondin. You could do it. And then he sees a man in the front row, and he says, do you think I could carry you across? He said, yes, oh my gosh, he's so excited he got picked out. Of course you can. You're the great Blondin. And so Blondin says to him, get in the wheelbarrow. We're going to go. He said, no. Take someone else, please. Eventually, the only one to take the trip with Blondin was his manager. How often is that our faith? I praise you, God. Yes, I praise you. I love this song. I love that message. I praise you again and again. My arms are up. And when the fire is cranked up to 7 times hotter, we put our hands down, put them in our pockets, and kind of just slide to the background. afraid to stand out in the crowd. Interestingly enough, the only person to go across Niagara Falls with Blondine was the person who had been with him the longest. He's seen what he can do over and over and over again, and he knew him the best. Tim Keller once said, "A furnace is when something important is taken away from you." You're going to come into some kind of furnace, and who do you want to go in with? What idea of God do you want to have? Only if you know He was thrown into the furnace for you, will you then feel Him walking in the furnace with you. It's only when you know that He has already gone into the furnace for you that you can feel Him walking with you during the trial that you face. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew the Lord would be with them in life and in death. They trusted Him enough to walk into the fire and that God was going to be with them. For us today, Jesus Christ has gone through that fire for every single one of us this morning. Not so that we can have a smooth and easy path that goes with the grain, but to stand out. Jesus promised that we would have trouble in this world, that life would not be easy if we continue to follow His way. If we continue to pursue the path of Jesus Christ, we would face trouble. But then He said, don't be afraid. Do not be afraid, because I have overcome the world. Whatever the furnace you face, whatever the trial, whatever the struggle, or the pressure you feel to keep up with everyone else around you, you have been called to stand out in the crowd. And you haven't been called to do it alone. We as believers need to cultivate countercultural community. We were not built to do life alone. Even in this story of these three this morning, they had each other to hold firm together, to be as one. The same is true for every single person in this room. We can turn to someone, to be honest with them, someone who won't turn their back on us or run and go tell on us, but they will stand with you and encourage you to work against the grain. They'll challenge us to be better, to defy those cultural norms. And the challenge for us this morning is to find that person in our lives. And it's going to open us up to where you're the most vulnerable, and it's scary. But it's going to be a life worthy of being called a Christian. And we need others to help us, to guide us, to walk with us, to encourage us to be better than we are today. See, the truth is this morning, we are all going to face pressure in this life. And the more we seek a deep relationship with Jesus Christ, the more pressure we are going to face to just fall in line with what culture tells us to do. So the question becomes, how do we develop a bold faith in the midst of that pressure? Are we in a place this morning to have the courage to go against the flow? And if we aren't, how can we grow that courage in our lives? To be able to trust God in the fire when it reaches our feet, when it's hot enough to vaporize the things that are around us. How can we cultivate a community around us that will remind us that we are not alone in the trial, we are not alone in the fire, that Jesus Christ paid that ultimate price for us, and He went through the fire before we were ever even a thought on this world, to take the sin of every single person who would come after Him, so that when we find ourselves in the fire, He'd be right there with us. The fourth man in the fire, helping us get through whatever that thing is that just tells us it's okay. Just it's okay. Go with the grain. It'll be a lot smoother this way. But we weren't called to just be smooth and follow the grains. We're called to be more. To defy the norms of this world and this culture and push against that. And that's what we're called to do today. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, we thank You for today. That You've called us out of different places, different pressures. You remind us that you will be there in the fire and in the trial and in the pressure. You are going to be there with us. That we can stand with strength and determination and say, I will follow you, and even if you don't save me, even if you don't come through on this particular thing, I'm not going to bow to that. I'm not going to worship that because I worship you. Give us that strength, God. We give you the rest of our time. It's in your name. Amen.